First Class with the 919th Grenadier Regiment, 709th Static Infantry Division, based on the Cotentin Peninsula. Herr Heinefetz, I visited the Atlantic Wall in May 1944, and I met some of the men in your regiment. I think
guys.
I remember something about your visit. You interviewed several and asked them about what about you? How did you feel about your post at the Atlantic Wall? I was pleased. And French on the Russians. They had terrible stories there. Many men returned without France was renowned for its comfortable run. I myself had been in in 1943. And I was wounded there. For many of the Atlantic and their reasons, although I do not know, I think it was at least half of us. But of formidable operator of my Ringstellung. Explanation of what the Ringstellung or was. The Tolbrook was a widely used type of small
Busy.
This was essentially a concrete pin set into the ground. Allowing a single soldier with only his head and shoulders showing above the ground. The designs any unpredictable prisoners in the construction. Dig the hole and pour the concrete under the support. Some Tolbrook also brought in 3 and placed in the ground like this. Concrete box used for. This was for storage of the ammunition and for a spare man. The concept of was that the men remained down during a bombardment. Then one of them would come up and hit the enemy, fight The disadvantage, of course, was that the operator himself was very low down and had my platoon sighted of unpaved tracks on sloping ground. Here, had an important fortress was originally now reinforced reinforced with extra concrete to the wall and concrete roof, having several guns fitted with multiple heavy machine paratroopers or pilots approaching from inland, and my Torpor was the defense against this. We manned the Tobruk position in shifts of 6 hours, then a sleeping break of 6 hours, then another shift. We slept in a requisition house about 1 kilometer away. Our officer was in charge of about 20 Tobruk at various sites in the area, all of a similar design. Our officer was a very experienced man, being the East an artillery commander, now technically by a telephone, but we had no radios. What was it like being manned? To stand on a in with our shoulders up out of the air. The gun was G-34, which did not require either, which would be the case with belt ammunition. The gun and its metal shield similar to the anti-aircraft. The gun constantly rotating the gun, watching for any signs of threat. The second man was officially meant to stay down in the underground box in case of attack. In reality, he would almost always be above ground, watching with binoculars or being otherwise useful, and we would change places regularly. As you can well imagine, Herr Eckert, the tedium of this task was not the presence of the was well known locally. French civilians because the former treaty in the past. There was a herd of dairy cows under instructions to give us everything. We rewarded boiled sweet from our rations. Farmer's daughter, very charming girl, taking the from English. It can be said that we have excellent relations with the locals. At the Tobruk on June 6th. I was. At midnight. My comrade was on board with me. Fiercely pro-German. Volunteered to serve in the front. You have yes. We both considered ourselves against an attack. Remember, after 1943, our German changed radically in against our enemy, now that I think about it, this invasion of Sicily. That is when the commanders and the politicians realized they must acclimatize us to gain because of these messages, we saw we knew that the loss of full blow happened because to attack German soil in the east. This would mean of our families under communism. This was motivation at that time. Did you have any indication or suspicion that the invasion was imminent on that day?
Vorwärts, Soldat! Ich halt's nicht mehr
The
aus!
general fear that the Allies would try to enter France in some form during the summer. We were told by the officers that this might happen at any time. I myself was given no specific regarding June 6th. But, having said that, it became obvious during the hours of darkness from late evening on the 5th to first light that something important was happening. There was a large amount of aircraft activity, even more than usual, and some continuous bombing to the south of us. The bombing was a regular
Nimm dich auf
night. Our officer came to the top room on a motorcycle at 1 a.m. and he reported that the situation was unprecedented. He told us that he had received reports of paratroopers landing to the south, and that regimental command were aware of the developments.
Give him hell, boys.
I am sure the aircraft activity continued and escalated towards darkness. There was a search fired sporadically, but the searchlights were out and ineffective. I saw flames in the sky to the north at several points. It must have been no signs of aerial combat. This was the edge, Zepp and me. We awaited first light with great concern. There began to be sounds of explosions and firing from the area southeast of us, which flared up and then died away. We reported this to our officer post on the telephone. The officer himself was not present. As the light came on, it became possible to see the activity in the sky. Faintly at first. There was a string of twin-engined aircraft flying north, in a disorganized formation. These aircraft had unusual black and white stripes on their wings, which I had not seen before. However, from our aircraft recognition system, I recognized these as C-47 types, which we were told were used for personnel transport and for paratroopers. All of this made it clear that an airborne attack on quite a large scale was happening to the south of us. And of course, this was exactly the threat that our Tobruk was positioned to defend against. What was your personal reaction to this revelation? And what was your comrade Zepp's reaction? Well, I had been in action in Italy, and I felt the familiar sensation of dry throat, shaking fingers, apprehension. I felt an excitement and a desire to be part of the combat, as this was my purpose and my role. I wanted the chance, to be quite frank with you, to show that despite my limp, I was as good a soldier as these allied men. I cannot speak for him, of course, but he had not been in action previously. Nevertheless, he remained calm and professional. He scanned 360 degrees with binoculars and told me that there was smoke to the south, ashes in the air. To the north, the seaward side, there was a view down to the stronghouse itself. In daylight, to observe part of the sea between the doors. Zepp said this view was obscured either by this or as he said these words, we came under a very powerful bombardment. The first explosion between us and the stronghouse. It was preceded by a whining sound. The explosion was huge. I deduced from the whining noise that this was not air, but the power was bigger than anything I had seen. My eardrum. was prone on the ground with his hands. There was a massive column of smoke and dust rising over the slope down to the bunker. I was injured. More of the began exploding around us. The underground room of the torpedo, me and MG down this This bombardment went on for about 30 minutes, and I could also hear the noise of the air nearby. Our concrete box shook. Concrete cracked in places. It was alarming. At one point, I opened the cupola cover and saw a large amount of dust in the sky. Also vapor trails in the air. The light was coming up fully, and the sky was becoming clear. These vapor trails were very clear. They were dark. I tried to contact our command on the radio, but the line did not function. When the bombardment slackened, I lifted my MG back up through the cupola, put my head out of the cupola cautiously, and looked around.
Sounds, go on, guys. Yeah.
The sight was very strange, and I can still see it now. It is not an exaggeration to say that the details are fixed in my memory, and I believe they always will be. To the south, the inland zone where I was to expect the partisans or paratroopers to approach,
I'm sorry.
I saw, instead of an advancing enemy, that the shelling had damaged the sheds of the nearby dairy, and many of these animals were running out of control in the fields. It was a dreadful thing. These large cows, with their full udders, were injured, bleeding, and in some cases, their hides were on fire. They were staggering or trampling in utter confusion. One began to charge towards me, obviously maddened, with its legs burning. I shot it immediately with the MG to prevent myself being trampled. That was the first shot I fired on June 6th, ironically. Looking to the north, in the direction of the stronghouse on the seawall, the shelling had created many mounds of earth and debris, and I could not see the house through the dust. However, there was a crashed aircraft there. This was an American fighter of the Mustang type, which was on its nose in the ground, on fire. Whether it was brought down by our blast or was hit by the shell fire at low altitude, the pilot was still in the cockpit under the bubble canopy, visibly moving, but the flames were coming from the engine very fiercely. As I watched, the wings began to burn, and then they exploded in a red and black fireball. A lot of his ammunition detonated as well, and tracer bullets shot out in random patterns all across the slope. I could no longer see the pilot. Overhead, there were many more fighter aircraft, all with the same black and white bands on the wings and fuselage, crossing north to south at low altitude. I could not see any Luftwaffe planes anywhere, which strangely was not a great surprise to me. The lack of Luftwaffe cover was an accepted fact by that stage, on all fronts. I did not know what to expect next, but I fastened the MG onto the shield in the cupola ring and sighted inland towards the south where I expected to attack. Zeb was sitting on the edge of his hedge, looking down there with binoculars. I asked what he could see, and he turned to me to answer. As he did so, he was shot directly through the throat. Because I was looking at him, I saw the bullet emerge from the back of his neck, causing a spray of blood and tissue. He remained upright, and another bullet hit him in the chest. causing a lot of matter
Und das
out of his head, along with shreds of his uniform. He was literally shot to pieces in front of me. He slumped down, and I fired a burst from the MG to the south, although I could not see the shooters. I saw a shape appear in the air from an area of trees to one side, and from my experience in Italy, I saw that this was an Allied weapon grenade.
vorwärts, Soldat.
It landed short some distance from me, and although some debris hit me in the face and shoulder, it did not injure me badly. I immediately fired on the trees, and the trunks of these trees fragmented as the bullets struck. The range was only about 50 meters. I saw no response from there, but I did see movement from my left, near the farmlands where the injured cattle were moving around. I thought that might be one of the cows, which were still mooing and thrashing their hooves in pain. However, I clearly saw a military helmet, green, with netting, and I recognized from the enemy troops I had seen in Italy that this was an American soldier. He was in long grass, probably trying to outflank me. I shot towards him, and I saw the helmet lift up in the air and spin over. After that, I saw a man's hands moving, in the manner as if he was touching himself, and I fired again. Did you have any emotion during these moments?
Stop this fighting it there.
To be honest, I knew that I was being surrounded. My heart was beating very heavily. But at the same time, my eyesight seemed very acute, and I was watching carefully for the next threat to my position. One problem was that my ears were still ringing from the bombardment, and I could hear very little. Were you hopeful of other troops coming to your aid? I knew that there were some armored troops to the south and southwest, but I really did not know what would happen. I believed that these Americans were paratroopers or airborne who were seeking to isolate the beach, which suggested that the beach would be under attack also. Although I could not hear well, I did glance over my shoulder and see the concrete roof of the stronghouse down at the foot of the slope. It was damaged, with big impact marks on the roof, and beyond it, between the roofs, I could see vessels on the sea itself, being mostly green or grey-colored craft, a type I had not seen before. I understood much later that this was the day of the largest seaborne invasion in history, or the biggest military operation ever mounted. But that is actually all I saw of the landing itself. Just that glimpse between the dunes. A lot of bullets on the water. I think this often happens to basic foot soldiers in a war. They are in historic battles or campaigns, but their view is limited to the fields around them. As you see, I was in a critical position.
Wir halten die Stellung.
The Americans were infiltrating around me in unknown numbers, and the situation at the stronghouse, which was my whole purpose in being in my Tobruk, was unknown. I had no working telephone, and I could not even hear properly. My comrade was dead. Indeed, Sepp was still lying near me on the hatch, his body bleeding heavily, but not breathing. I decided to stay where I was and continue to man the gun. I reached down into the Tobruk and brought up several fresh ammunition canisters and had these ready inside the cupola. I fired several more bursts into the trees, but could not see if I hit anything. Several shots came back, hitting the steel plate of my MG. The shield became deformed, but it stayed intact. Suddenly, because I could not hear the approach, a man appeared next to me. tumbling through the air beside me. He sprawled on the ground beside the gun, and I saw he was shot repeatedly through the chest. He was a German soldier from the Stronghouse, whom I recognized. He was carrying a rifle. I looked around and saw several more of our troops running towards me from the direction of the beach. One by one, they were all hit by bullets, knocking them down in moments.
Fire.
One man was hit horribly in the head,
Stop that.
and he lost most of his skull. Another man was hit in the stomach, and he writhed on the ground, thrashing his legs and vomiting. Two men threw themselves down next to me, and one was immediately hit in the neck and had his head partially severed. I fired a very long burst in an arc around the whole front of me, and this enabled the other man on the ground to get behind me, sheltered by the gun shield. He was a lieutenant, although I did not know him. Anyway, he had an MP-40 submachine gun, and I was reassured to have an officer with me.
Is it enemy?
He shouted in my ear, and I could just understand what he was saying. They are landing tanks on the beach and burning out the Stronghouse. I was confused at this, because I did not think it was possible to land tanks onto a beach. I assumed he meant they were cars. He shouted in my ear, "The Stronghouse is lost. Bring the gun and leave the Tobruk."
This guy needs to die now.
I said,
He's coming too close.
"You order me to leave the Tobruk." He said, "We will take the men and go to the next bunkers. We will join the troops there." There was a further line of bunkers inland, about 2 kilometers south. I did not know what the situation might be there. It might be worse than this. However, more of our troops began to appear from the beachfront, and I fired off large amounts of MG bullets to cover them. Some were shot, but I also hit 3 Americans with Thompson guns, whom I saw emerge from the trees, and they tumbled onto the ground. The lieutenant stood up, showing himself as a target, and no shots came. I was impressed at his courage. He shouted, "Now we move." This proved to be a good choice of moment.
Blut!
We had a handful of men in addition to this lieutenant and myself. I unclipped the gun, and I placed over the barrel a leather ring that we used for carrying it when the gun was hot. The group of us moved quickly towards the trees. One of the tracks that formed the crossroads continued past there in the rough direction of the second line of bunkers. I moved as fast as possible with my limb. As we came level with the 3 dead Americans, one of them moved and seemed about to rise. He had a Thompson gun close to him. The lieutenant stooped down quickly and shot him in the head with his MP-40. Then shot the other 2 men likewise. One of our men took a Thompson gun and spare ammunition magazines from the bodies. I would not have done it. I knew from Italy that if a soldier, whether German or Allied, was captured with enemy souvenirs on him, then his treatment as a prisoner would be violent or even lethal. On the Eastern Front, it was an immediate death sentence apparently. But the Thompson guns were superb items, being famous as the gangster guns from the 1930s, and they were hard to resist. Armed in this way, we advanced down the earth track towards our inland bunkers. I struggled to keep up now with my limbs, but I did my utmost. After a few paces, I heard the officer curse loudly. I looked round and saw that 2 of the troops had disappeared. They were literally nowhere to be seen, and there was no shooting or struggle. My hearing was recovering, and I could hear explosions from the coast and aircraft overhead. But I saw or heard no sign of those two men. They have deserted. They prefer to be taken prisoner, the officer said. But I saw at the Stronghouse, the Allies are not taking prisoners today. They burned the whole thing with a flamethrower, with the men in it. I do not know if this was true, or if he said this to motivate us. But we continued, now being a few men, myself and this lieutenant. It was very warm, and I was very thirsty.
Right.
My leg was becoming painful because of my limb. We stayed in the cover of the trees, because huge numbers of aircraft were passing overhead. Some of these appeared to be twin-engined bombers, and there was a large amount of smoke rising on the southern and eastern horizons. Other planes were the Yabo type, and often they would swoop down and fire on the ground ahead of us. When they fired, long streaks of white light would shoot down onto the ground, which one of our men said were rockets and very dangerous. There was a strong smell of smoke, burning rubber, and aircraft fumes. As the breeze came from the beach area, it brought with it sounds of activity, detonations, machine gunning, and many engine noises. There was the definite sound of tank tracks. I knew these were not ours, as we had no panzers on the beach line itself. The lieutenant gave me a drink from his water canteen, because I had left mine behind in the Tobruk. Because of the need to go up and down through the cupola, it was not possible to carry the regulation water bottle, gas mask case, and haversack equipment. To my surprise, the lieutenant's water was mixed heavily with schnapps, and it was very refreshing. That lieutenant was a complete contradiction in many ways. I never knew his name. Shortly after this, we came on a small group of civilians who had prisoner laborers with them. As we passed, the lieutenant told them all in French to go to a cellar and hide. Who were these prisoner laborers? It is not remembered much, but all Reich-controlled territories had substantial numbers of prisoners of war or civilian prisoners working as manual laborers and farming or construction workers. These people were mostly Russian or Polish, mostly male, but also with women among them. I do not know the numbers, but there must have been hundreds of thousands of these people in France alone. Huge gangs of them, hundreds of them, would be at railway stations, sleeping on the wasteland beside the tracks, under the guard of a few armed engineers. These ones that we passed on that morning of the 6th, they appeared to be farm workers. All were men. As we went by, one of them said something, made a comment. I do not know what exactly. I do not even know what language it was that he spoke. I heard a shot, very close, and ducked, then looked back. The lieutenant had shot this laborer in the chest with his MP-40, killing him outright.
Rifle or what?
The other civilians and laborers backed away from us, and we continued onward. Did you make any protest about this shooting? No, I did not. It was not in our nature at the time to make protests to officers. Also, the situation was very tense and uncertain. Also, in all the confusion, there was a real danger that some of the laborers would rise up against us and try to overpower us. I am not justifying what the officer did, you understand, but I place it in context for you. We came on from that point into a low area where the land was flooded as a defense. Our commanders had diverted the local river to disgorge partly onto this point in order to deny its use as airborne landings or for troop advances from the coast. This floodwater was about 1 meter deep and covered about 2 square kilometers. And beyond that was higher ground, where our second line of bunkers was positioned. There was a wooden walkway leading across the water, but this was bombed and burning. The only other way was to skirt around the whole flood area to reach the bunkers. At the side of the track, there was a Farmo-type half-track, the type without armor, parked under a stand of trees, and there was nobody present with it. Possibly the crew had deserted or been killed away from the vehicle by the airborne. At any rate, this powerful machine was there for the taking, with the starting lever still working and a small amount of fuel. The officer ordered us into it, with the intention of driving it around the floodwater to the fortifications. We men bundled onto this vehicle, and one of the soldiers started it and began to drive. Of course, this was the worst thing we could have done, because the Farmo was very visible from the air. Although we drove under a long line of trees, which partly shielded us, it was only a few seconds before a fighter plane came down to look at us. It came in from over the flood, and I believe it was a Mustang type, although it was moving so quickly that it was literally a blur in my vision. It fired its guns on us, and the tracer shot along the water, over the roadway, and hit us in the engine and cab. I was sitting at the back of the vehicle, and I saw the bullets smash into the sides of the cab, tearing off all the metal body plates. With no armor, there was nothing to protect the driver, and he was thrown out of the vehicle onto the road. The half-track veered around, and we ran over the driver as he rolled in the roadway. Then the Farmo rolled down the small embankment into the floodwater. There was nothing to be done for the driver. His body was completely crushed open by the tracks of the Farmo. The engine was on fire, and this made our presence even more conspicuous from the air. I jumped off, with the officer and the remaining soldiers plus our weapons, and we continued on foot along this track beside the water. The plane returned a few seconds later, and machine-gunned the vehicle again. Looking back, we saw it blow up completely as we ran on. We found there were other troops on this track, going in the same direction, and the officer grouped them together and ordered us to work as a team. We were now about 20 in number. These men were a combination of Wehrmacht infantry and various Eastern recruits in the ROA insignia. Can you explain the ROA? This was a formation of men originally taken prisoner from the Soviet and Polish armies earlier in the war, who had now sworn an oath to us and agreed to work for the Wehrmacht. I believe they were stationed on the Atlantic Wall to keep them away from their home countries, where they might defect again. We in the Wehrmacht regarded them as unreliable, although I have heard that some of them fought to the death in Normandy, fearing the consequences of being recaptured by the Allies. Whatever their motivations, these fellows ran with us along the path. We were spread out in a long column, and we had to throw ourselves flat several times as planes came over. Sometimes the planes fired on us, and at other times they simply flew along the road, firing at the empty pathway. They were at liberty to do as they pleased, with no Luftwaffe to challenge them at all. Several of our men were hit, and those that were struck were simply left by the path, as it was impossible to bring them with us. I remember that one man, one of the ROA, was hit in the abdomen by several bullets. body was cut in half, I am sorry to say. The rest of us could only step over the two pieces as we ran on. Towards the end, we were fired on from ahead of us, killing one of our group. But this proved to be another German Tobhuk sighted near the bunker line. When this Tobhuk gunner realized who we were, he waved us on towards the bunkers and called them to warn of our approach. My leg was making it almost impossible to run, and one of the Russian men helped me by letting me lean on him. I was grateful. He did not have to do that. Nobody ordered him to do it. And he probably saved me from being left behind near the Tobhuk. Finally, we passed through barbed wire positions and slit trenches, and we came into the second-line bunker zone itself. This was a series of concrete blockhouse structures, 3 of them about 100 meters apart, well camouflaged, on slightly rising ground, with a good field of fire over the roadway, the floods, and over an area of marshy land which separated this area from the coastline. These forts had been bombed, and there were craters all around, but they were intact. There were many vehicles jumbled up around the approaches, half-tracks, Kubelwagons, motorcycles and horse carts. These bunker structures were what we called resistance points, and I saw that they were armed with 75mm PAK guns, which were on wheels inside the buildings, with their barrels projecting through the embrasures and a variety of MG positions. There were slit trenches which were crowded with troops who had retreated from the beach area, and among these was a Panzerschreck, or bazooka, crew. There was a single 20mm flak gun behind the bunkers to cover them. This was a strong area to defend, as the approaches were lower-lying, difficult to cross, and had little concealment. I felt more confident here, and I was seen briefly by a medic who gave me a soldier's cocktail, which was a mix of morphine and amphetamine against the pain and exhaustion. I went into one of the bunkers, which had a PAK gun aimed out over the marshes. They were glad to see me with my MG-34. I positioned this on its bipod mount in one of the slit embrasures, and then waited. What was the atmosphere in this bunker? The men who manned the bunker were questioning us new arrivals frantically. How many? Who are they? What weapons? Are there tanks? Flamethrowers? And so on. But what did we know, really? We knew there was a sizable force approaching, with tanks of some kind, and there were also American airborne troops in the area. In this blockhouse, people were jumpy, constantly calling out that they saw something, arguing with each other. The mood was nervous. A Feldwebel, or sergeant, came in and gave us criticism for our behavior, and we became more orderly under his command. This Feldwebel told us that reinforcements were coming up from the south and east, and that we had only to hold this bunker line for a few hours before our panzers would arrive to push the attackers back to the beach and into the sea. This was an excellent little speech, and it rallied our nerves well, because we knew that there were armored divisions dispersed to the south. The time now was around 10 or 11 a.m., I think. My watch was broken in the Famo crash. I did not have much desire to know the time exactly. I felt sure that these thick concrete walls of the bunker would hold out, and that we would hold the line. I had a view of the roadway and flooded area in front, and I squinted along my MG sight, wiping all the sweat and dust from my eyes. The interior of this bunker was very humid and quite dark, with all the troops hunched over their weapons at the embrasures, whether the KR gun, or machine guns, or rifles. I am sure that everybody's heart was beating as hard as mine, and that everyone was trying to calm themselves. Of course, we were expecting a ground attack, but the Allies were determined to deny us the chance to fight in such a way. We heard a shouted warning. Jawohl! Fighter bomber. I peered up through the concrete slit and saw a horizontal line of 3 aircraft descending on us over the marshes at great speed. These planes had very large radial engines, which from our recognition sessions I knew was distinctive of the Thunderbolt plane. I recall being surprised, because the planes appeared to be bare metal. The sun reflected very brightly off their surfaces. There was nothing any one of us could do, although I and several others fired our MGs up in an attempt at flak defense. This was rushed and ineffective, because the Thunderbolts were simply too fast. The flak cannon fired, and I saw the 20mm cannon tracer fly up to seek the planes. The 20mm shells were very bright and snaked slightly in the air. Some of these shells actually hit one of the planes in the wing, knocking pieces out. This plane lifted up and banked away, but the other 2 continued to descend, and they released bombs from under their wings as they approached us, at probably 100 meters height. The bombs flew out almost horizontally from their wings, and the pilots lifted each wing in turn to release them. It is strange how the mind remembers such a detail, but in the heat of the moment, the senses are taking in all this information, and it is indelibly imprinted on the memory. The small dark bombs, 2 from each plane, came tearing across the marshland and into our bunker line. The bombs slapped into the flat ground in front of us and bounced up, tumbling over in their momentum. One bomb bounced straight past us and went between the bunkers. Then another hit our roof and deflected off without exploding. It detonated somewhere behind us. From my slit aperture, I could see the blockhouse on our right. This was hit by at least one bomb, and it was covered in dust and smoke, but appeared to be standing. The Thunderbolt aircraft came down on us repeatedly. I think there were 6 or 8 waves of them in all. Each time, these very shiny planes flew low, flipped their wings to release their bomb load, and the projectiles would race towards us, bouncing across the ground and scattering around our position. There was no pause between the attacks. As soon as one load of bombs detonated, the next wave was on the point of unloading their bombs onto us. Our flak hit one of the planes in the early waves. I saw this aircraft lose its propeller and engine cover, and then the cannon tracer pierced its wings. The plane exploded in a very long streak of fire, and did not lift out of its attack run. It raced straight down onto us, and hit the ground to my left, where many of the vehicles were scattered. There were huge explosions from that side, which I could not see. The succeeding waves were not hit by flak, and I realized that our 20mm had stopped firing. The bombs kept coming at us, and I saw one of them skip across the ground and tumble into one of the slit trenches crammed with infantry. The explosion threw up many pieces of men, weapons and clothing, all mixed together in the shockwave. I gave up looking through the embrasure. All we could do was to crouch down under the embrasures and put our hands over our ears under our helmets to protect our eardrums. The bunker shook several times, and the explosions sent many chunks of shrapnel and debris hurtling through our concrete apertures, which ricocheted around the interior. One of the PAK crewmen broke down and began screaming. His comrades punched him to the ground, and he lay sobbing there, while another man took his place. Was there much other loss of self-control? In fact,
Voice.
no. The men were well disciplined. Some of the men produced crucifixes or rosaries and said prayers. Others seemed to be simply cursing. Both were inaudible, but I could see their mouths moving. This bombing lasted perhaps a minute or two, but seemed endless. Cracks appeared in the concrete ceiling of the bunker, and large pieces fell from the upper edge of the embrasures.
Bit of experience. Shit.
Some of this masonry hit our troops, crushing several limbs. These men could only lie on the concrete floor and wait for the situation to end. When the bombs stopped, there was a pause of several seconds, and I peered out. I could see, through all the dust and smoke outside the bunker, that the blockhouse on our right had been blown open partially.
It's going good.
There was a large hole in one side. The trench that had been hit was a horrible mess, with many dismembered bodies lying around it, many smoldering or contorted
We don't have
and
many
blackened.
leaders here. We need
I
some-
could hear flames and detonations from the other side of our bunker too.
Okay, back.
Then the shout went up. Yabo again! It seemed that the Americans had an endless stream of planes available, which were always arriving freshly armed on top of us. These new aircraft were also Thunderbolt types. However, as they approached,
We're still here.
I saw the white streaks of light from under their wings and the descending lines of vapor which showed they were using rockets. I had never seen rocket explosions close at hand before, and did not know what to expect. The effect of these rockets was in some ways worse than the bombs. The warheads used some kind of incendiary material which exploded with a very intense white light and then burned and expanded with a hissing noise. I saw one of the first rockets detonate in this way against the other bunker. The white flames covered the structure and entered the hole that was blown in one side, all the time making this eerie, hissing sound. Really,
Pak 40.
it sounded like an animal hissing or breathing. The other rockets hit our line in very rapid bursts, and our zone around the bunkers was absolutely filled with the bright, pale flames.
Panzerschrak.
One rocket hit our blockhouse on the wall outside the PAK gun aperture, and the explosion was completely blinding. The PAK was about 10 meters away from me, and I saw many fragments of burning material pour in through the aperture and fall onto the floor around the PAK. These fragments themselves expanded and burned, until in a few moments the gun seemed to be covered in these bright, blazing pieces of material. This fire simply would not go out. It covered the PAK crew and sank into their ammunition pile. There was complete panic and disorder at that point. The men near the PAK were consumed in these white flames, including the weeping man on the ground and several injured men nearby. The uniforms of these men peeled off in scorched pieces, and their bare skin was set alight by the fire. A round of the 75mm ammunition detonated in the flames, and the shell blasted around the interior of the bunker, glowing red with tracer. This shell smashed off the wall, off the ceiling, and off the other walls.
Okay.
Each time, it hit a man or group of men, and cut them horribly before bouncing elsewhere again. Somebody threw open the steel door of the bunker, and I hurled myself at it. Other men were competing with me to get out of that inferno in the bunker, and we fought each other with our bare hands at the doorway. I stumbled through, over the body of a man who collapsed outside with his hair on fire, and I ran a few paces away from the structure. I made the mistake of looking back into the bunker through the door. I can tell you that the interior was a vision of hell, an obscene sight that remains with me. The white burning material was still expanding, and burning alive the men who had not escaped through the door. Men were rolling and struggling on the floor in the flames. Some were clawing blindly at the walls, trying to feel the root out, with their faces all covered in smoke, because their clothing was on fire. PAR rounds and MG rounds were detonating in there, in the confined space, and the tracer was screaming from one wall to another, tearing up the bodies of men where they stood or lay. I backed away from the door as a couple of other men staggered out after me, with their backs and legs on fire. Finally, all I could see inside the bunker was the flickering white light of the incendiary and many flashes of exploding rounds. All that I could hear was the screaming and groaning of men, and the strange hiss of the burning rockets as the last salvo of them exploded in front of our line. I shook myself and looked around for guidance. My bunker was destroyed from inside, and I could see that the bunker on the right was in a similar state. The hole in its side was issuing white flames and smoke. On my left, the third bunker had its steel door still closed, but its apertures were streaming with the incendiary flames, and there were explosions inside. Nearby, the jumble of vehicles was completely on fire, with the trucks and precious half-tracks thrown onto their sides, and many wheels and bits of engine debris strewn about. The wreckage of the crashed Thunderbolt plane was among them, burning fiercely, with its tail rising up above the rest. Behind me, the 20mm flak gun had been hit by bombs, and it lay in pieces in a crater with its crew. I was one of the few survivors of the attack. What kind of incendiary was this in the rockets? I learned afterwards that this material was a phosphorus weapon. It is a very powerful explosive chemical that the Allies were starting to experiment with. The devastating thing about this phosphorus was that the fire kept growing and expanding, and it flowed almost like a liquid, eating into anything it touched. My God, I saw some of the bodies of our troops in the trench lines that had been hit by these rockets. The bodies were reduced to skeletons, very black and charred, as all the body material was burned off and consumed. I confess that I was terrified at the sight, not knowing how soon the Thunderbolt planes would come back and strike us again. Would this happen to me within a minute, or 5 minutes, or 6? Would I be reduced to this skeletal state soon. I was left stunned, incapable of action for a few moments. I suppose that the psychological impact of such weapons is part of their effectiveness. That is true. Even the survivors are left fearful and incapacitated. As for me, I had no gun. My uniform was scorched and in shreds. The morphine cocktail was wearing off, leaving me trembling. The air was full of smoke and dust. A very harsh glare, which made it difficult to see. Two other men came up, both Wehrmacht troops, and we crouched down, considering what to do. There were no officers visible. A few other men were appearing from the smoke, but these were running away southwest in complete disorder. A man appeared who was armed with a Panzerschreck, or bazooka. He had the firing tube, but he had only 2 projectiles, which he carried tenderly in his arm, as if they were prize rabbits. That is the way it looked to me, with my confused senses. From the roadway, we could hear the sound of tank movement, which was rising and falling. Our view was obscured by smoke and dust, but this was feasible because the coastal breeze was strengthening across the zone. The 2 troops said that they were going to retreat because the bunkers were destroyed. However, the man insisted that he wanted to fire his 2 projectiles. He said that these could destroy any Allied tank at 200 meters, and that we would be decorated as heroes when our own panzers arrived. It occurred to me that he was mentally confused, but I was also bewildered, and I was past the stage of being afraid for the future. For this reason, even though the 2 other men retreated on foot to the rear of the bunkers and left the zone, I stayed with the Panzerschreck man and agreed to operate as his loader. I took an MP-40 from the body of one of our men and 2 spare magazines. We took up a position between 2 wrecked vehicles, a half-track and an armored car, behind a concrete slab. This was near the crashed Thunderbolt, but the smoke from its flames was blowing away from us. We had a good view along the road track beside the floodwater. The trees along the track were burning in some places, and there was debris of machinery scattered along the ground. The Panzerschreck gunner told me how to load the rocket projectile into the launcher tube, which was over his shoulder. I loaded one of the 2 rounds, and then rolled away as he instructed me, so that the rocket blast would not hit me. I flattened myself, holding my MP-40, and looked into the roadway. I could see the outline of a tank coming through the smoke from the burning trees. This tank was very high in outline, and as it advanced on us, I saw that it had a white star on the front plate. This made it very obvious, almost like a tin plate target at a fairground shooting store. In my confused mental state, that is the image I had of this tank. The range was about 200 meters. The Panzerschreck man said, "It's a Sherman. We can finish him." And before I could respond, he fired. A huge spout of sparks and fire came out from the back of the tube, burning my face with the heat, although I was away from its jet. I saw the projectile go streaking towards the Sherman, and it struck the front plate, low down between the tracks. The explosion was not large, but I saw many fragments of metal burst off the hull immediately, and the tracks stopped moving. The vehicle halted and rocked violently, and I was surprised that the machine gun in the hull did not fire. I suppose this was because the projectile had killed or injured the gunner. However, the turret machine gun fired on us, and the bullets ripped up the wrecked vehicles that we were hiding behind. We crouched behind the concrete slab, and I reloaded the rocket launcher. The Sherman stopped shooting at us, and I heard crackling sounds, which sounded as if it was burning. We peered over the concrete slab, and saw that this tank was on fire, and its crew were climbing out of the hatches. One of them had a submachine gun, and I fired on him with my MP40, knocking him down immediately. The other crewmen scattered and ran to the back of the tank. I rolled away because I saw that the Panzerschreck man was going to fire again. After he fired, I heard another small detonation, and I peered around the edge of the slab to see that the rocket had actually hit a second Sherman, which was attempting to steer around the immobilized one. This second tank was hit on the edge of the front hull by the drive wheel, and its track was blown off and hanging loose on the roadway. This was an incredible success for us, to have hit 2 tanks with 2 shots, and I remember feeling a sensation of great pride in this achievement. Of course, our actions were punished by the second tank, which fired on us with high explosive. These shells blew up the vehicles near us and showered us with debris. We were trapped behind the concrete slab and unable to move away from its shelter. In between the explosions, I could hear the revving and cranking of other tanks trying to maneuver on the narrow road. My mood changed completely. I thought that we were close to death and close to losing our battle. The Panzerschreck man was hit by shrapnel, which hit him in the shoulder and neck, and he began bleeding heavily. He threw away his rocket launcher and took a grenade from his boot, handing it to me. I thought that he wanted me to throw it at the tanks, but what use was that? Then he told me that we should blow ourselves up rather than be captured. He was either very fanatical or mentally unbalanced, I believe. Did you consider blowing yourself up? Why did I do such a thing? There was no reason to do that. We were honest foot soldiers, defending France and ultimately the Reich from aggression. As we crouched there behind the concrete, with these high explosive rounds smashing up the wrecked transports around us, there was the noise of another tank from the south, from the direction of our lines. My spirits lifted greatly. I believed that our panzer reinforcements were arriving at the last possible moment to assist us and defend this bunker line. I imagined a great formation of our panzers, pushing the Americans back into the sea, as the Feldwebel had promised us in the bunker. However, all that arrived was a single, solitary Stug 3 gun. This was a self-propelled 75mm PAK gun on a low panzer chassis. It was renowned as an excellent vehicle in use against tanks. I had seen these Stugs used in Italy, and they had inflicted great losses on Shermans. But this was only one, and as it advanced on our position, I expected to see others behind it. There were no others, and it turned out that this Stug commander had risked his vehicle to approach the bunker line alone and assess the situation. We gestured to the Stug, and it presumably saw us, because it drove rapidly around us and fired several shots at the roadway. I heard impacts and explosions from down there. I tried to lift the Panzerschreck man, but I was too weak and he was too heavy, and I left him lying behind the concrete.
The hill or something.
I do not know what happened to him. The Stug, having seen the situation on the road, began to reverse away slowly, still firing its gun. It did not stop for me, but the commander, who was behind an armored shield on the roof hatch, gestured to me to climb on. I was able to take hold of the armor skirting and clamber onto the back of the vehicle, which was extremely hot due to the engine vents. I held on there, and the Stug reversed back from the road, pushing aside many of the wrecked transports, and moved to the south, away from these bunkers. I took a look along the side of the Stug as I held on, and saw that there were 3 Shermans now apparently disabled in the road. The 2 we had hit with the rockets, and another which was also on fire and standing in the floodwater. There were other tanks behind these 3, and infantry moving around between them, but the immobilized Shermans were obstructing their progress. In this manner, we withdrew from the line of bunkers and used a forest track to retreat several kilometers to the southeast, where a number of armored vehicles were assembling into a small battle group in the woods. What kind of force was this? It was not impressive, to be frank. They were from an armored division to the south of the sector. There were several Stugs, several of the large armored cars, and some infantry in Hanomaks. Maybe 10 vehicles in all, and 30 infantry. That is probably about all. The vehicles were heavily disguised with foliage on their superstructures, but even so, the crews were reluctant to move them out of the woods. We could see and hear the Allied Yarbos overhead, swarming across the countryside at low altitude, and there was no mobile flak gun in this group. Also, the command situation appeared to be confused. I fell into conversation with the Panzergrenadier men, and their view was that the divisional commanders were slow in responding to the attack. Was the word attack, raid, or invasion? How did the men view the landings? We all used the word attack at this stage. It was only later in the day that the word invasion was used more widely. At least, that is what I remember. Was that the end of your combat on June 6th? It was not. At this point, which was late in the morning, there was a lull in the fighting between the 2 sides. Possibly, the Americans were concentrating on building up forces from their sea vessels into their land pocket. Certainly, the German troops used the time to organize themselves to bring up more vehicles and troops. This lasted an hour or so, certainly less than 2 hours. But all the time, the Allied aircraft were moving overhead and firing into the German zone. As I had no trace of my unit from the original bunker, I attached myself to these Panzergrenadiers. I received medical attention from their medics, and they gave me another amphetamine tablet, which boosted my energy and my frame of mind greatly. I was armed with the MP40 I had picked up, and I obtained more magazines and grenades from these men. These troops were mostly very young men, with older Feldwebel commanders. They had not yet been in contact with the Americans, and they were eager to engage them. There was also a field kitchen which gave me soup, bread, and boiled sweets. I was desperately hungry, and I ate all they could give me, sitting on an ammunition crate under a tree, with those thunderbolts flying back and forth overhead. There also came into the woods a unit of SS infantry. This was a platoon of about 20 youths who were extremely young, about 17, and they had been cut off from their commanders by a Yarbo attack on a road to the south. They were very heavily armed with MG-34 and MP-40, and these weapons looked out of place alongside their boyish faces. So all these troops and vehicles were packed together in the woods, without clear leadership, and unwilling to move outside because of air attacks. Two of the armored cars went out to do reconnaissance of the American position and intending to take prisoners for interrogation. These armored cars did not return, and the level of explosions and firing began to increase again after the late morning lunch. Going to the west side of the woods, we could see smoke and flashes in the farmland on that side, where the land was higher and not flooded. All of this led to a great concern that we were being outflanked and isolated. In the end, I think after midday, the Stug commanders finally received clear orders from their divisional command.
Deine Waffe!
They were to fall back to a fortified line about 2 kilometers south, where there was a German ARK artillery in emplacements. That line was to be held at all times until more reinforcements arrived. The Stug commanders told us men about this very clearly, and we began to form up into a column to retreat to the new line. The road to the south was a route I did not know personally. It was an earth track suitable for farm tractors and so on, but it was partially sunken below ground level and screened to the north and west by thick hedgerow of the type the French called bocage. These low roads with hedge screens are typical of the Normandy and Brittany countryside. The fields to either side were believed to be mined. This was quite a strong route for a retreat, and we began to move out along it with the armored cars first, then Hanomaks with their infantry on board in the vanguard, then the SS infantry on foot, and the 3 Stugs in the rear. The rearmost Stug faced backward and moved in reverse gear behind the whole column, with its gun pointing to the enemy. Because of the narrow road and the number of tight bends, the vehicles could only proceed at walking pace. The Stug crews told me this might actually be a benefit, because the vehicles were covered with so much foliage that they might look like part of the hedgerow from the air, and moving at speed would destroy this illusion. The soldiers might find so many hopes to cling on to in a retreat. Because of my leg injury, I took up a position on one of the Stugs, crouching among all the trenches and trees on the rear hull. The road became increasingly sunken below the countryside, until the top of the Stug was barely level with the surrounding land. This was excellent for concealment, but of course, it also meant that the vehicle could not move off the road for any reason. I heard the Stug commander say that if any vehicle broke down, the Stug would have to run over and continue moving. The mood was very tense. It was hot and humid, and nobody knew how close the Americans might be, whether the airborne troops or the beach forces. There were parachutes visible on the ground beside the road at some point, and we saw several American paratroopers who appeared to be dead, still hanging from their parachutes in the trees beyond the fields. One thing that we saw on that first stage of the retreat disturbed me. We slowly rounded a curve in the track, shielded by the hedgerow, and plainly visible along the top of the embankment were several dead American troops. They were in a kneeling position, with their hands behind their backs, and it seemed they had been shot methodically, then simply left where they kneeled. The crew of the Stug that I was riding on commented that this must be the work of the SS boys, who apparently had a taste for such things. It concerned me greatly that these Americans, who seemed to be airborne troops, had been captured and deliberately executed in such a way. Did you learn who was responsible for this?
Die Stellung!
No. And the events immediately following this lead me to think that the Allies themselves never learned of this act. This was only a few minutes into our retreat. But the next events happened with a terrible rapidity. As we all dreaded, the Yabos appeared from the southwest direction, meaning that the planes could see us behind the headlands on our north side. There was nothing we could do about this. Our destination was only a matter of kilometers away, and so the column continued to advance slowly. Hoping for the best, as always, I reasoned that our vehicles were so well camouflaged that the Yabos would not notice us. At first, this seemed to be the case, as from this group of about 6 Thunderbolts, 2 flew over us without showing an interest. I am sure I was not the only soldier in that sunken road whose heart beat with relief at seeing this. But then, the 3rd and 4th planes dived down to look at us and came racing over the roadway at low altitude, so low that I could see the pilots looking down at us from their bubble canopies. The crews shot up at them with small arms fire, but this had no effect. The entire group of Thunderbolts swung around and attacked us from the north to the south, following along the line of the sunken road, one after the other. The situation was absolutely hopeless for us in the column. I saw the long streaks of white vapor shoot down from under their wings, and there was barely time to take evasive action, even if the sides of the road had permitted it. As it was, the vehicles were confined within the road, unable to leave the sunken channel, and the Thunderbolt rockets simply raked along the column while it was restricted in this way. I jumped off the deck of the Stuck, with the remaining energy given by the amphetamine tablet, and landed on the edge of the embankment under the hedges. I remained there, motionless, and from my prone position, I was able to see the effect of the air attack on the entire column, as far as one of the Hanomaks at the front, a distance of about 100 meters, until a curve in the road hid the rest of the column from me. The American rockets poured along the column, many of the projectiles striking the fields on either side, and some striking short, exploding among the bodies of the American troops behind us. I saw that these rockets were high explosive, which I had seen used in Italy, and I knew how destructive they could be. I saw the rockets devastate the American corpses, severing their limbs and their heads, and throwing the pieces for long distances across the fields, in trails of blood and smoking flesh. For this reason, I think the air attack destroyed the evidence of the executions, if that is indeed what they were. But other rockets came smashing directly into the German troops and vehicles in the sunken road. I held my hands over my head and looked through the gap between my helmet rim above my eyes and the ground under my chin as these weapons struck us. The sunken road was turned into an absolute slaughterhouse by these American projectiles. Their high explosives fell on the Stucks, ripping off the armored screens on their sides and blasting away the foliage they had massed on their top decks. 2 of the Stucks were hit on the engine deck, and the engine grills burst open in big spouts of fire. The last Stuck, the one reversing with his gun pointing back down the road, was hit somewhere on the upper hull, and I think that the rocket went through the hatch on the top into the crew compartment. This Stuck threw itself from side to side, slamming into the embanked walls of the roadway, and I saw that the entire roof of its superstructure was being blown out. I think that all the ammunition inside was exploding, because the detonation was enormous, sending pieces of the roof whirling up into the fields. Many pieces of the crew from inside were thrown up also. The whole explosion was a real tornado of bodies and steel. Every piece trailing fire and smoke as it fell to earth. This was not the end. The rockets struck along the sunken road, exploding among the SS boys who were hurrying along there. The impacts came every second, slaughtering these boys as they ran or dived for cover. The rocket explosions ripped up the sunken track, and the high walls on either side deflected the shrapnel and debris back again, so that the path was full of bouncing, shrieking metal. I saw a group of half a dozen of these SS troops torn into pieces, with their innards ripped out and their empty bodies left burning in the road. A few of them, further ahead, ran forward to escape the carnage, but in front of them, one of the Hanomaks was hit by a rocket, and whether by accident or some design by the driver, it began to reverse backwards onto the SS troops behind it. This Hanomak was blazing with fire, with all its gasoline flooding out, and it reversed out of control, straight into the troops. The boys were flattened by the half-track, run down, one after the other, and the Hanomag kept reversing and trampling the bodies of the troops until it finally crashed into one of the burning Stuks and came to rest. The entire roadway was full of flames, broken bodies, shattered machinery, and exploding ammunition. Some of the SS were still alive, but on fire, and the ammunition in their pouches was detonating, which was injuring them yet further. I saw one youth struggle to his feet, with his whole body on fire, and then the grenades that he carried tucked into his belt exploded, sending his limbs in different directions. Other troops crawled or dragged themselves, struggling in the pools of burning gasoline, until they were enveloped by the fires. I waited for about a minute, then perhaps 2 minutes, and then for a longer time, but I don't know how long exactly. I heard the Yabors flying off in the north, and I must say that my chest was heaving very hard, making my torso rise and fall on the ground under the hedgerow. I was at a loss about what to do, in an absolute confusion. I was also hit in the back by debris, and this made it difficult for me to breathe. I had been through a series of battles that day. The initial Tobruk fight, then the second bunker line, and now this attack on the column. Each time, the German forces were overwhelmed by vast superiority of numbers and weaponry, especially in artillery and attack from the air. I had a feeling of great despair, doubting that we could ever resist this enemy that had such machines and such resources. I was in a bad condition, physically and psychologically. The morphine and amphetamine were declining, I thought, in my system, leaving me weakened and confused. The pain in my back, my chest, and my leg was very severe. I struggled with myself to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to surrender and give up the fight.
Das Blut!
But another side of my mind said that to give up now was meaningless after so much effort when I was close to the next line of defense. In the end, I slid down into the sunken road and made my way along its length, intending to reach our next positions. A few other survivors were doing likewise, and we had to climb over the many shattered corpses in this roadway, with many severed limbs and heads strewn around among the burning vehicles. In some cases, the fallen men were still alive, and panting or groaning miserably, and this sound was added to the crackle of the flames. What was done to help these wounded men? I think that nothing was done. We had no morphine or bandages, and the wounded men needed doctors, nurses, and medical equipment. I had difficulty walking at all, and my breathing was very painful, so I could not carry any of them. One of these wounded was hit especially badly, with much of his stomach hanging out into the road. But he was still conscious and moving his hands. After I stepped over him, I heard a shot behind me, and I saw that one of the other survivors had put him out of his suffering with a single bullet to the head. That was a merciful thing to do in these circumstances. Finally, we left the destroyed column behind, and we reached the fortified lines that we were aiming for. This was a strong point of bunkers with PAK guns, and it was organized much like the previous one that we had just seen destroyed by the Yabos. There, I was seen by a medic who said I had several broken ribs, and I was sent to the zone behind our lines in a horse-drawn cart, which was being used to transport the wounded. I was the least wounded man in that cart. The others had lost ears, hands, or eyes. Many were burned, with their scalps gone, or their charred uniforms stuck to their damaged skin. I felt guilty, being so lightly wounded, it must be said. Was that the end of your war? No. I was given several weeks recuperation at a convalescent center in the south of our zone. Although being among the able-bodied patients, I was also tasked with stripping and repairing rifles and machine guns that were jammed or out of order in some way. This was not arduous work, and I found that it kept my mind occupied. I had many unwanted memories of my experiences on the 6th June, which prevented me sleeping and affected my concentration. In the convalescent unit, of course, we followed the progress of the invasion and our defense in as much detail as possible. The mood of us recuperating men was quite pessimistic, as we had all seen the enormous power of the weapons that the Allies used, and their superiority in the air. As we became aware that the beachheads were linking up, and then the Cherbourg Peninsula was cut off from our zone, most of us began to accept that the Allies would create a permanent occupied zone in France. Some of us said that this could be contained, and it would allow our forces to grind down and destroy the enemy forces over time, preventing them from attacking us further. Most of the men, though, did not believe that the pocket could be contained for long, and that if the Allies broke out and spread across the eastern plain, they would surround Paris quickly. This turned out to be an accurate prediction of what eventually happened. Did you fight against the Allies again? In July, I rejoined the division, which was reorganizing a lot of the men who had retreated from the coast in the first days of the invasion. My role was as a transport driver of an Opel truck carrying ammunition and grenades. However, I was taken prisoner in late July, when the Americans overran our rear echelon areas quite rapidly. We were ordered to fight, but we had rifles and grenades against groups of Shermans, and we surrendered willingly. After surrendering, we were kept in a prison compound near the coast. There were about 2,000 Germans and other nations in this camp. Everybody was in there. Officers, foot soldiers, marine troops, Panzercrews, and Luftwaffe mechanics. The Americans took little interest in us and allowed us to organize the camp as we wished. How was it to be a prisoner of the Americans? Well, even those of us who believed that the Allies could be thrown out of France fell silent when we saw the way the Americans were organized and the resources they had to work with. Their planes were constantly in the sky. Everything was mechanized. All supplies were carried by truck or train, with seemingly no concern over the amount of fuel used. If a jeep or a truck broke down, it was neglected rather than repaired, and a fresh one was used, still shiny from the factory. Instead of using local food, they ate from tins and cans of food that were made in America. We found this fascinating, and we formed an impression of an unstoppable power that would simply roll over any obstacle. And this is what eventually happened, as we now know, both in France and in Germany. Chapter 2. Omaha Beach. The Resistance Point Gunner. Henrik Nauba was an Unteroffizier, corporal, with the 325th Infantry Division, stationed near Vierville. Herr Nauba, I did not meet you when I visited the wall in 1944, but I stopped in your sector several times. It was only after the end of the war that I thought back over those events, and I realized that the sector was located on what the Allies called Omaha Beach. Yes, I have also heard the terms Omaha, Utah, Sword, and so on in the years since the war ended. I think the first time I heard these code names was in late 1946, when I was working in a car factory that was being managed by British engineers in Germany. I got to know some of the British people very well, and when I told them where I was taken prisoner by the Americans, they said, "Oh, so you must have been on Omaha Beach. I was on Sword Beach, or my brother was on Juno Beach," things like that. Of course, these terms meant nothing to me. We Germans had no knowledge of Allied terminology until recently. The first time I heard the phrase D-Day was also after the war ended, of course. During the war, we Germans referred to it as the invasion of France, or the Normandy attack. May I ask, in your mind now, do you think of that place as Omaha or Vierville? To me, it is Vierville. That was the name of our position, which was a resistance point. I was posted there in April 1944, and we were inspected by Rommel himself shortly after my arrival. Did you see Rommel personally? Yes. He was a very energetic and active man. He walked very briskly and spoke rapidly. I did not have any dialogue with him, but he came to our position and spoke with our officer. He asked very factual questions about the amount of ammunition we had in the post, how old the weapons were, what we knew of the design of the Allied ships, and so on. He was quite a short man, but had a very powerful presence. Although, as with all famous leaders, how much of this was due to our expectations and preconceptions, it is difficult to say. What was the mood among your unit in the days and weeks before the invasion? There was a feeling of great tension, because we were constantly watching and waiting for a possible attack. We all believed that the Allies would try to attack Europe in the summer of 1944, and the summer was reaching its height, so a landing of some sort seemed inevitable. The amount of bombing by aircraft and strafing by Yabo-type planes was also building up enormously in May and early June, and this had to be a prelude to some kind of event. Our warning level went up to level 2 on the weekend before the invasion. But if I remember correctly, It came down again to level 3 on Monday the 5th. The waiting was unnerving,
Zusammen.
and also the issue of constantly worrying about what form the attack would take. Would it be by air or by landing ports, or in conjunction with the communist fighters in the French resistance, or a combination of all these? Would it be against us in the north, or also on the western coast of France? All these questions plagued us, with no answers. And
Das
every
Blut!
day, the sea in front of our Widerstandsnest, or resistance point, looked exactly the same, giving us no clues at all. Can you describe the Widerstandsnest, the resistance point? This was an area of about 30 meters width and 10 meters depth, set on the top of some cliffs beside one of the ravines that led down to the beach wall.
Nobody's
The point had a trench across its width, and several running to the rear in jagged lines. Inside, these trenches were faced in concrete and had wooden floors with drainage points. Outside, there was a raised concrete parapet about 1 meter high, in which there were firing points, which were vertical slits. There were 2 machine gun points at either end, aiming through these points. It was about 300 meters down from the cliff to the nearest part of the seawall, and there was a long, uninterrupted line of fire along the beach to the northwest. The guns were MG42 types, which were extremely powerful. The resistance point was surrounded by barbed wire, with a single exit point at the rear, and the dunes on top of the cliffs around it were mined. There were also mines hanging on cables down the cliffs, which could be dropped on any attackers from the beach. The position was open to the air, but steel covers were available to drag across the trenches in case of a bombardment. To be honest, we also used these if it rained heavily. The position had a searchlight between the 2 guns and a reinforced area for ammunition and grenade storage.
squash.
Our team there was 10 men, 2 men on each gun, the others being observers, sentries, and men intended to fire from the trenches onto the beach with rifles. A second team of 10 men were either resting or working nearby. We had a small villa as a headquarters adjacent to the officers' post. We were commanded by a Feldwebel, and our officer commanded 4 such positions along the high ground in the area. On the other side of the ravine that went down to the seawall, the cliffs continued, with further resistance points built along there. What were your orders in terms of defending the beach? We were to keep a constant lookout, of course, and make regular reports by cable line to our officers' post, which was about 1 kilometer behind us. In case of an attack, we were told specifically to hold our fire until any enemy troops were 400 meters from the edge of the beach. Although the MG42 could fire effectively beyond 2,000 meters, this instruction was intended to ensure that we had the largest possible target area on each attacking soldier. We were told to fire at their chests when their torsos were above water. That is to say, when they reached the shallows and were wading. We were trained constantly on the importance of our task. If the Allies were allowed to gain a foothold in our sector, however slender, their huge material resources would allow them to build it up and threaten the whole of France. This in turn would give them a puppet state to use in order to harass and blockade Germany itself. The concept of the Allies actually invading Germany seemed unimaginable at the time, it must be said. Our officers sought to educate us very thoroughly on this matter. They emphasized that if an attempted landing could be defeated by us on the shoreline and thrown there, it would take years for the Western Allies to recover, allowing us to consolidate a defensive line against the Soviets in the East. Its effect on Western public opinion might even force the English out of the war altogether. That idea was constantly emphasized. All in all, we were fully aware of the great burden of responsibility resting on us as the first line of defense against an attack. What is your memory of the 6th June and the preceding days?
Peterson.
The preceding day, the Monday, was very blustery and wet, I remember, and we were on duty in blocks of 2 hours, on duty and then off. The tension was very noticeable because of the intensity of the bombing. Throughout the weekend and the Monday, that is, the 3rd, 4th, and the 5th, there were heavy raids overnight to the southeast and Yabo attacks during the daytime. The Yabos usually flew over us and went inland. They only occasionally strafed the beach. This is something I found strange when I thought about the invasion afterwards. The level of attacks on our beach were very intense at the last minute, but very low in the previous days and weeks. I suppose this was to prevent us deducing that an attack was impending on our specific beach, but the Yabos could have caused much more disruption to us than they did before the landing. On the 6th June, I was on duty in the resistance point, at the western corner MG slot from 2 a.m. onwards. As we went up to the point in the dark, there was heavy bombing to the south again, and a very high level of aircraft noise. There was flak fire from points in a semicircle inland of us, and further explosions in the distance. We all agreed that something was up. Something was going to happen soon. Did this cause you alarm? Or fear? I think that most of us were simply sick of the tension of waiting. An event of some kind, even an attack, would at least break the tension, the silence, the sense of foreboding that we had. For this reason, some of our men said, "Let them come soon," which made other men wink and laugh. But I think we all preferred to have the situation clear, to let us start fighting at last, rather than waiting. What happened from 2 a.m. up to the landing itself? The level of noise and explosions rose and fell. As the moon was full, we could see large numbers of aircraft in the sky at times, between the rain clouds, and there were various flames and explosions in the sky on the inland side. Several times, we saw an aircraft on fire, heading out across the sea towards England, and in some cases, these burning planes descended and appeared to hit the sea in the distance. On our gun, I was the gunner, and my loader and I both had good quality binoculars. Using these, I saw that many of the aircraft were twin-engine types, and we debated whether these were bombers or something else. I know today that we were seeing the parachutist transports returning and scattering over the sea. I recall seeing one of these planes at low altitude, followed very closely by another plane, which we thought appeared to be a glider under tow. These two planes descended rapidly and disappeared into the sea. All this went on, and we became increasingly convinced that an attack from the sea would come soon, as some kind of assault was evidently already happening inland. Our officer appeared at about 4 a.m., bringing with him the spare team whom he had woken, and he ordered us all to be completely prepared for a possible sea landing. I think that first light came at about 5 a.m., and it slowly revealed the beach to us. Nothing was changed there. The sand was studded with large numbers of steel obstacles, and these were very prominent as the tide was out. The sky was overcast, and the offshore wind was quite strong. As time passed, with my binoculars, as I scanned the horizon, I began to see many shapes materialize. The sea was slightly foggy out there, but I could still see first a handful of shapes, then more, and finally, an absolute wall of these grey outlines stretching almost across the whole horizon. All of us men who had binoculars stood and stared at this apparition, while the other men demanded to know what we were looking at. We handed the binoculars around for a few seconds, and many of the men took a look. Their reactions varied, ranging from curses to a kind of apprehensive laughter, or just silence. In the meantime, our Feldwebel was on the cable phone, speaking to the officer's post. He came to us at the parapet and said, "Men, they're coming. They're coming in strength. You must be ready." Or something straightforward like that. The whole situation was unfolding in a way that seemed almost like a dream, detached from reality. This great assembly of ships was simply looming out of the sea mist, just getting bigger and bigger, closer and closer, and nothing at all was happening on our side. I could not hear any firing from our coastal batteries further along the coast, and no Luftwaffe aircraft were visible overhead. The sea between us and the ships was completely empty. There was not a torpedo boat, or a seaplane, or anything. I had a great sensation that we were on our own in front of this colossal force. It was a strange sensation. It felt like a great challenge, almost a superhuman challenge. It was unnerving, but I also felt a certain relief, even excitement, that at last we would meet this enemy that threatened us. At the same time, like soldiers everywhere, I busied myself with my gun and with getting our position as ready as possible. At this point, a very large formation of enemy bombers came over. These were the big 4-engine bombers. I think they were the Lancaster type. We saw them streaming towards us over the ships on the sea, and the nearby 80mm planes fired on them, but they were too high in altitude. They bombed us, and we threw ourselves under the steel towers, fearing the worst. These bombs came down at an angle, diagonally out of the sky, and the explosions made the whole cliff shake and sway under us. But we realized that they were missing us if we were the target, and the bombs hit the inland areas behind us. This was a great relief, and we laughed in a nervous, apprehensive manner as the sound of the planes moved away inland too. We climbed up and prepared ourselves, with the massive fleet of ships on the sea getting closer by the second. The slit in the concrete parapet gave a wide arc of fire, and I practiced sweeping the gun left and right, which I had done countless times in drills. Just as I was doing this, the sea bombardment began.
You must have expected the bombardment, surely.
Yes, but the intensity was astonishing. It was heavier and also far more accurate than the bomber planes that had just hit us. I had been under artillery fire on the Eastern Front, of course, where I learned to brace myself against it, both physically and mentally. That was difficult enough for me and for most others. This bombardment, however, was by warship carriers. That was obvious by the flashes that we could see on the horizon, among the many outlines of the advancing ship, and then the noise of the shells approaching us in the air. These shells made a noise similar to a gas blowtorch being run at full strength, and at first they passed right overhead.
Jesus Christ.
We could see them as bright shapes flying inland over the beach. Huge shapes too, the size of a car engine or similar. They exploded a few hundred meters behind us, and then the next salvo came down much closer to us. We dragged the steel plates over our trench covers,
and we huddled underneath them with our guns. The power of the explosion made the concrete of the trench ripple and fracture, and if I glanced up, I could only see enormous clouds of earth and sand hanging over the dunes and the beach. The shock waves punched all the air out of our lungs and made our eyes bleed. The shrapnel that flew around us was monstrous in size. I saw one piece of shell case as big as my arm, which simply fell down out of the air and jangled at the end of the trench, still smoking. But other pieces were flying left and right horizontally, screeching and smashing off the parapet and the steel roof plates. It went on and on, for salvo after salvo, with absolutely no pause in between the impacts. It was as if a gigantic hammer was falling on the beach, trying to pound it flat. That is how it felt to me.
How did the men react to this bombardment?
Most of us remained calm and distant. My loader was trembling as he started, and as I noticed this, I realized that I was also trembling. One man near me could not take the stress, and he tried to run by ducking outside of the trench zone, which was covered overhead by the steel splinters. I saw him try to run. He was caught by an absolute storm of shrapnel, and his torso was ripped across and broken open. Absolutely ripped open, from front to back. He fell in the open part of the trench, and countless other bits of debris fell on him, mutilating him further. His body produced a lot of steam in the cool air, which filled the trench for a while. This was a terrible, shocking sight for those of us who saw it. At one point, the end of the concrete trench was blown open by one of these shells, showering us with earth and debris. When the smoke from this cleared, it meant that we could see out of the end of the trench and down to the beach for some distance. It was possible to see the shells landing in salvos of 3. Each salvo made very tall plumes of smoke and debris that slowly fell to the ground. I saw one of the shells explode inside one of the other resistance points, about 500 meters from us. That point was similar in design to ours, but with a single machine gun in a concrete top-roof bunker. The whole installation was destroyed, and pieces of concrete were thrown high into the air, with the bodies of the men who were in it. It was terrifying to watch those men flung out, knowing that the same thing could happen to us if we were hit directly. In the end, however, there was a final intense fall of shells, and then the shelling stopped altogether. The cessation of the noise and blast waves came as a great relief, as you can appreciate. My ears were ringing, and I had blood on my face from my eyes. We knew that the halt in the shelling meant that the landing must be imminent, and so we washed our eyes in water from our canteens and slid away the metal covers, and we slowly emerged from the bottom of the trenches. One by one, our men put their heads up over the lip of the trench they were in, or over the parapet. I lifted the MG-42 back and recycled in the firing slit. I remembered that my father had told me many times that he did this as a machine gunner at the Battle of the Somme in the First War. He and his comrades hid deep in their dugouts with their guns, and then emerged to fix their guns in place again before the British arrived. Now here I was, doing the same thing. In the time that we had been undercover, the ships and boats of the attackers had come very close to the shore, and now we could see vessels that I would have called invasion barges, but later I learned were landing craft. I did not yet know what nationality these troops were. There There were very many of these landing craft approaching the beach. There were at least 10 directly facing me, coming through the initial turn of the wave of the beach. They were about 1 kilometer from my position, I would estimate. But all down the beach, we could see more of these craft approaching. The sea was absolutely alive with these vessels, which all seemed to be the same design and color. Behind them, there were small warships and all manner of other ships covering the sea. The sea was completely covered with this huge collection of vessels. What went through your mind, seeing this force approaching you? I don't recall having any conscious thought or emotion, other than anxiety that my gun might have been damaged in the chest. I fired off a 1-second burst to test it. The other MG crew shouted at me to hold fire and remember our orders.